the global debt hitting record highs for almost every single country. And what's happening here is we're seeing a new way of thinking about debt in the world, right? We're seeing a new way of countries saying we can keep borrowing so long as we keep our interest rates low enough that we can manage the payments on our debt. As a result, we're kind of really pushing the limit of how much debt we can have, because we're saying we can just keep paying for things and supplying economies with money, because as long as we keep our interest rates very low, our maintenance cost of being able to pay back that debt is very low. So it gives us the ability to keep doing that. And the U.S. is about to have their over $3 trillion deficit for the second year in a row. But the U.S. Treasury yields at 10 years down at 1.33%, which means their real yields are negative when taken into account with inflation. And interest rates and prices are inverse, right? So when interest prices drop, it means the prices of bonds are increasing. That's because people are buying them, right? And vice versa. So why are people piling into debts? Well, some theories are that they don't expect them to stay, these real rates to stay negative for long. They expect there to be a turnaround, or they're looking to pile into something safer with expectations of more deflation coming in the future. So we'll see how all that plays out. But around the rest of the world, you look at people like Japan's about to hit 10 trillion US dollars in debt, which is 250% of their GDP. However, they're not paying more in interest each year than they did in the mid 1980s, back when their GDP was only their debt was only 66% of their GDP. So it's really a balance between interest rates and the amount of money being taken out here. So as long as you keep your interest rates low enough, it's easy to maintain that debt. And this is interesting. So there's a chart in there, but the all-time borrowing has exploded from an average of about 30% GDP in the 1970s across the top 20 economies to about 125% of GDP in the last 2 or 3 years. And in contrast, when you look at interest rates, the cost of borrowing here, that's plummeted from about 12.5%, for instance, in average or in the 80s, to about close to zero today. The United States at 1.3% for their 10-year yield. Other countries like Greece, everything have much lower rates, some even approaching negative rates. So, you have very, very low interest rates, and that allows you to borrow and borrow more debt, because paying it back, your payments are so low. As long as you can keep your economic growth at a level higher than the interest you have on your debt, and your interest is very, very low, paying back, making those payments is easy. And as long as you budget for that, you're able to keep basically borrowing and balancing against it and saying, well, our payments are still low. The problem is when you raise interest rates, that's going to cause a major problem, because all of a sudden you're going to be tacking on tons of new money for you to maintain your debt. So that's going to be harder, and it's going to be hard to get new money. So those compounding effects are really what people look at in the long term, is how long can it last before you have to raise interest rates, and how much can you raise them and balance, kind of stop your economy from overheating versus not blowing out yourself out and having to default on debt because you can't make those payments. So this is really, and this is not a bad thing, right? Spending lots of money is not a bad thing. When you have like a coronavirus effect, right? You kind of have these problems that are global, and you have to pay for everything. So paying for things isn't a bad idea. The only problem is as you keep happening, as this keeps happening, we keep spending more and more money. That analysts are saying, and looking in the market, you're saying, why are they doing this? Last time we didn't do enough, right? It's viewed that we didn't do enough last time to pay for things during 2008 and other crises before that, and that's why a lot of jobs disappeared. That's why a lot of people lost their jobs, lost their homes, was because we didn't do enough to stimulate the economy. We had stuff like stagflation and problems in the economy. We didn't see a lot of economic growth post 2008 for some period of time. It took a while for it to get back off the ground. So the idea now is to avoid that. We'll just spend lots and lots of money, and we'll beef the economies up. And once they have all this money, they'll propel them to grow even faster out of these losses. So and then on the counter side, it's, well, we're taking on too much debt, and our inflation is getting too high. What are we gonna do about that? So the idea here is that there's a massive bet on the secular stagnation hypothesis, where a lot of people are betting on private savings and as an investment for a long time. So the amount of money that's being saved is putting all these bonds, everything in the market. That savings will allow us to be able to keep paying down our debt at those minimum payments for an extended amount of time, giving us the ability to borrow more debt because our interest rates are so low. So we can just keep borrowing and borrowing and spending and just paying the minimum for as long as we possibly can. So this is something that we're going to have to be taking a look at. And as of now, global debt is over $90 trillion US dollars across the world. And it just really goes to show that we thought there was a limit on debt, but it might actually be a lot further away than we think. But that's also because of these conditions, and we're kind of entering uncharted waters here. So we're going to have to keep our eyes on this. But the key here is the sustainability is a relationship between interest rates and growth. So as long as a country grows faster than the rate it pays, it's fine. Like I've said, as long as your economy is growing fast enough, you can pay your minimum payments. But if the interest rate exceeds your growth, whenever that happens, that's when you have some serious problems. So you can see that inflation can help your GDP, and can help with tax revenues as well. These can all help fight against inflationary forces and help beat down on your debt. But we'll see how that goes coming in the future, because we have to find a balance for this, right? So really what it's saying is everyone's got a lot of debt. Everyone's trying to balance that with low interest rates so they can keep on borrowing to spend, so they can avoid having a stagnation and a lack of economic output going forward after all this. The question is, where's that balancing and the tipping point, right? How do we keep everything in balance to make sure that this is sustainable? We don't borrow too much and put ourselves in a position where we might have defaults, we might have problems. Because if we plan to raise interest rates in the next 2 or 3 years, companies, firms, individuals, governments, everybody's going to have to make sure their debt is not crushing them. Otherwise, those increase in interest rates are going to really hurt people. They're really going to pound down on everybody at every level.
Yeah, Janet Yellen just came out last week and said that it would be inconceivable for the United States to default on its debt. So
Right.
it is,
because
well,
that's the, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying that, for countries just like ours that have the same sort of economics, when they say default, it's other countries have done that and they've come back. There are strategies to these things, but the United States has never defaulted on their debt.
Yeah, and it's important that the United States doesn't default on its debt, because if your country never defaults on its debt is viewed as safe. Your debt is the highest rated. Everyone wants to do their business in U.S. dollars. Like, we look at the United States economy, we say this is the strongest economy there is. This thing's never going to fail. Therefore, we can borrow in U.S. dollars. We can denominate our debt in U.S. dollars. We can accept U.S. dollars. But as soon as you show that it's human, that there's a crack there that can be exploited, it's just like everybody else. That, I think, would cause a major, not only material impact to markets around the world, but psychological impact for going forward is how people view where they put their money, for safety. Because right now we rely on people buying lots of government bonds. We rely on other countries taking their savings and putting them to work in government bonds so that we can actually make more money and borrow. We can keep bringing the capital in and then pay off those interest payments. So it's also a psychological thing. We really don't want that to happen. And again, I don't think we will see that happen because we can print money, but that's not necessarily the problem. Like, yeah, we never defaulted on our debt, but if we cause a type of hyperinflation or some similar type event, that will be very bad domestically, which can then lead to the potential for defaulting as well. So it's really just, I found that interesting to read about, is how many countries are pumping in debt, and really just this psychological and methodology change in how we deal with debt, how we view too much debt, and how we're trying to balance, right, how much spending we're doing with what we can actually afford to repay. And I just thought that was interesting. It's really just all about interest rates, and those are going to become very important in the next couple of years as more and more debt exists.
Congress has up till the end of the month to get their act together and either decide if they're going to move the debt bar up, or they're going to just keep it as it is and do a stagnation for it, like what they've been doing, and not have to deal with that problem right now.
I mean, they're definitely not going to. I think they'll wait to the last minute. I think that they'll say, like, parts of the government have to, like, shut down or blah blah. They're gonna talk about all these fears, but I don't think that's gonna happen, because again, there's a much bigger picture here. And if what we understand, if this is the new understanding of debt, then we probably have more wiggle room to go. I disagree with it in the long term, as I think a lot of people do, but that's how this is working. That's how we're managing to keep doing this. Is we have hundreds, almost $100 trillion in global debt via countries, but as long as we can make our minimum payments, that's fine. So if you're a consumer, you hit a debt limit and then you can't borrow anymore because you're viewed too risky. Well, how does that work with countries? How much debt do people have? How much leverage can exist before something goes wrong? And that's going to be, I think, when interest rates hit, and depending on future growth. So really the balance is keep your countries growing faster than your rates on your debt, and keep your rates on your debt as low as possible. And as long as you maintain that over time, the theory is that you will slowly eat away at your debt. It will slowly begin to pay itself down. But I guess the only problem is if we just keep spending and spending and spending, we can, it's all about keeping it sustainable. If we lose the sustainability and the balance, then we're screwed. So it's going to be interesting to watch. But this all kind of ties into our general inflation, debt, future economics, what the next couple of years going to be like. So I just thought it was interesting to bring that up and talk about that. And I learned some stuff about it too, digging more into learning about interest rates, bonds, these different markets and different parts of the market that move capital as opposed to being traded by retail investors. So
Yeah.
very interesting.